Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another edition of This is Revolution Podcast. I am your host, Jason Miles, and we have another great show. For those of you that have seen the intro clip and maybe saw the thumbnail for tonight, we're going to be taking another deep dive into neocolonialism in the 21st century with a new friend of show, journalist Owen Schalk, who, from my understanding, Jean Bajlan is trying to get to write a book for Zero. We want Owen to write a book for Zero because we really like his writing. We definitely read a lot of his articles to prepare for the show, as well as other academic journals. But before I bring in my co-host, I have some announcements. First announcement is tomorrow morning for me, 1 p.m. Eastern time, I will be on The Majority Report, where Sam Cedar wants to talk with me about the piece I wrote a few months back. It's self-published in Medium called I Was a Teenage Anarchist, about the culture of authenticity, the culture of deconstruction. So tune in to The Majority Report, and you can see me. I'm not going to fuck with Sam Cedar like I did last time. I actually told the guy that his booking person, I said, let Sam know I will not be using the soundboard. My setup is not ergonomically correct where I can fuck with him and he can't see me fuck with him. But I am going to tease him a Vigeland because my Broncos destroyed her Giants. So get ready for that. And I need you guys to tune in because I need to get more views on that show than Pascal. That's the level of competition that we have. But I do want to say this between Pascal and before I bring in our other co-host for tonight, Kuba. And shout out to Jean Bajlan, who isn't here tonight, as he is expecting, the Bajlans are expecting a new Bajlan soon. So he's kind of on new Bajlan watch. So we're all constantly asking, how's Mrs. Bajlan? This is an exciting time for them. But I do want to say that one of the inspirations for me to write this piece is the fact that I do work with Pascal and Kuba and Jean, and even, people like Teray pushed me to the point to write something like this that I'm getting on The Majority Report. So I wouldn't be able to get on that show and talk about this piece if it wasn't for these wonderful people. So without any further ado, I'd like to bring in my homie, my dog, Pascal Robert.
Peace and greetings to the chat. Peace and greetings to the audience. Peace and greetings, Jason Miles. And we're just going to sing this for Jason's appearance tomorrow. We're moving on that moon.
No,
Broadcasting sky.
There's a lot of things going on. Also, the date just got moved, but next 2 Fridays from now, I'll be doing an in-store appearance at Stories Bookstore in LA with Zero Books. I believe I have the flyer up for that. So the date is wrong. It's actually going to be November 5th. It just got changed, but it will be 7/8/45. Stories Bookstore. Today's cyber dystopia is a product of yesterday's techno optimism. Zero Books, a left-wing imprint from the UK, hosts a conversation about today's digital dystopia and the decline of American empire. I'll be on the panel with Are You Serious? Daniel Bessner, also has been on the show a few times, and screenwriter Kyra Nicole Rogers. So it's going to be a good time. So if you guys are in the LA area, come out, and then we're going to do an after party at the Rainbow and act like we're Motley Crue. So get ready for that one. And I'm sad I took this long to bring this guy in. You know him as Death Star Middle Management. It took a while for us to bring him in because he was firing a stormtrooper and making sure he lost his stormtrooping benefits. Darth Kuba.
Hello, everyone. I mean, like, Death Star HR has just been a shit show all day. I had to fire this guy, and it was right after our diversity, equity, and inclusion training. So, it's really awkward. But, like, stormtroopers are technically non-marginalized people, so at least I didn't have to fill out that additional paperwork. But it is hard, right? Like, they have to take their imperial healthcare card away. You have to watch while they take off the armor, It's pretty depressing for everybody, but then we just blew up a minor moon, I felt better.
And Andy William, no, I did not make this in the background. This is some weird algorithmic music that comes with this program that we use, but there is a new album in the works that should be done. It was going to be done this weekend, but it looks like it's going to be done next weekend. It'll probably be out before Thanksgiving, of instrumental stuff that's chill like this. So if you want to hear some of the tracks that are going on it, if you hit me up, like DM me on Twitter or something, I'll send you some MP3s of some new stuff that I'm working on that's like super chill like this. But let's play the clip that took me several hours to make, and it's a little longer than usual, so hope you guys enjoy it.
In recognizing a communist, physical appearance counts for nothing. If he openly declares himself to be a communist, we take his word for it. If a person consistently reads and advocates the views expressed in a communist publication, he may be a communist. If a person supports organizations which reflect communist teachings, or organizations labeled communist by the Department of Justice, she may be a communist. If a person defends the activities of communist nations while consistently attacking the domestic and foreign policy of the United States, she may be a communist. If a person does all these things over a period of time, he must be a communist.
At Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, delegates from 44 allied and associate countries arrived for the opening of the United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference. Invited by President Roosevelt to the first major world financial meeting since the London Conference of 1933, they will work in the seclusion of this White Mountains resort. Zhang Shi-kung, one of China's representatives, with Secretary and Mrs. Henry Morgenthau. United States Treasury Secretary Morgenthau heads the American delegation. On the opening day, in his role of acting conference president, he addresses the meeting. To be discussed are plans for the stabilization of world currencies. All agreements must be ratified by the governing bodies of the nations involved before becoming effective. Delegates to this monetary and financial conference pose on the hotel lawn. These meetings are designed to promote trade in the post-war world and to create a foundation for lasting peace.
The brutality and invasiveness of the capitalist imperialism of the 19th and 20th centuries was readily evident. With utter ruthlessness, the imperial powers of the era smashed open markets with gunboats and plundered the wealth of Asia and Africa through conquest and occupation. The process of decolonization in the 1960s and 70s raised hopes that a new era of peace and prosperity was about to dawn in those parts of the world that had been ravaged by imperialist exploitation. Unfortunately, those hopes have been dashed by the rise of informal networks and methodologies of imperial dominations. While the territorial empires of old no longer exist, and imperialism is now a dirty word, behind the facade of independence, the peoples of the developing world continue to labor under foreign economic and political domination. However, today this domination is rarely exercised directly. Instead, it is often realized through indirect economic pressure with so-called international institutions such as the IMF and World Bank acting as the vanguard of this insidious neo-colonial order. What are the systems that perpetuate this state of affairs? How do the IMF and World Bank serve the interests of Western capitalism? And what is the cost to the people of the developing world? We'll ask these questions and more. This is Revolution.
The World Bank has always been deceptive about its role in the international economy. It attempts to portray itself as an institution looking out for the interest of not only poor countries, but for poor people within those countries. That has never been the case. The bank is pushing the interest or promoting the interest of countries in the first world and for an elite sector in the third world. That was true in the 1970s. It is particularly true in the 1980s.
The third indispensable element in building the new prosperity is closely related to creating new jobs and halting inflation. We must protect the position of the American dollar as a pillar of monetary stability around the world. In the past 7 years, there's been an average of one international monetary crisis every year. Now, who gains from these crises? Not the working man, not the investor, not the real producers of wealth. The gainers are the international money speculators. Because they thrive on crises, they help to create them. In recent weeks, the speculators have been waging an all-out war on the American dollar. The strength of a nation's currency is based on the strength of that nation's economy. And the American economy is by far the strongest in the world.
All right.
That was a great intro video, Jason.
Thank you. Thank you. I love finding Richard Nixon footage because I know Pascal gets all like excited and angry at the same time whenever he watches it. So
I think Nixon, Nixon is a fascinating figure. You know the old saying that your boy Adolf, friend of the show Adolf Reed says, we got more from Richard Nixon than any Democratic president since him.
the EPA got out of Vietnam, OSHA.
One thing that's interesting about Nixon is, unlike so many other establishment figures, Democrats and Republicans, he wasn't a dyed-in-the-wool neoliberal on economic issues. He was willing to be pragmatic about economic policy and regulation as long as it worked to his political advantage. Everybody afterwards was so committed to this sort of Hayekian free markets ideology that they couldn't even do things which were politically advantageous to them if it counteracted that particular economic framework.
And, you know, we're not saying that Nixon was a great president. We're just pointing out a critique.
Well, Nixon did a bunch of horrendous, horrible stuff. I mean, you know,
he was a U.S. president. Comes with the territory.
Let's just, I don't want people being like, oh, these motherfuckers love Nixon now. Like,
Shirley makes a very good point. Most of the things that Nixon did was because the left was much stronger then,
Yes.
and he really did feel that the barricades were being stormed.
Well,
And
I mean, Chris Evans always points out in what's his name, Kissinger's book. Kissinger talks about Nixon being terrified because they got the buses around the White House, and he's like, they're coming for us.
Yeah.
But you know, that's a long time ago. And again, we're not saying we're fans of Richard Nixon. We're just pointing out a Nixon critique. That's all. Please don't. These motherfuckers love Richard Nixon.
I mean, I think the biggest crime of Richard Nixon is the fact that Richard Nixon secures his victory in 1968 by basically getting the Vietnamese to scuttle a peace agreement with Lyndon Johnson and perpetually continue the Vietnam War when it could have ended if they actually had agreed to that détente with Johnson, cynically, in order to ensure his victory in 68, which literally Lyndon Johnson accused him of committing treason in the audio tapes on the subject.
Matt L., we will do a whole other show on Nixon and China, but I don't want to get into the weeds on Nixon and China today because we want to kind of stick within the neo-colonialism framework. That's a derailing that I don't think we're ready for right now. But let's bring in our new friend of show, someone I'm very excited to see back. I booked his first appearance. I'm gonna stake my claim on this. I was the one that found his article and said, I'm booking this guy on the show. And then I wasn't there when he came on the first time. So please welcome, coming all the way from Manitoba, journalist, author, Owen Schalk.
Hello.
Can you hear
I'm
us now?
happy to get my applause finally. Pascal didn't have a soundboard when I was on the first time.
That's true. I did not have a soundboard, but I did enjoy your.
Pascal's a tough crowd.
Pascal won't even give you the. He won't even give you the. He'd be like, "Yeah, that's Owen. Hear my questions, motherfucker." That's Pascal.
You better have
I've already shared with Owen my appreciation of his writing and work.
Well, Owen, let me start off. Let's get people kind of. There's a lot of terminology that we're going to be throwing out in this conversation. So let's kind of break down the first one. The IMF writes, as you call it, neoliberal structural adjustment policies. Can you paint a picture for us what those policies look like? And do those plans ever have any material benefit for the citizens for a country like, let's say, Burkina Faso?
Yeah, so I'll start with the first part of that. We really see the emergence of structural adjustment programs in the 80s. For the first 25 years or so of the IMF's existence after Bretton Woods, it's very much oriented toward North America and Western Europe. The UK was the largest borrower at the time. But then in the 1970s, there were three important events that sort of motivated a geographic shift toward the global South. The first one was the so-called Nixon Shock, which we saw in the opening video, where Nixon essentially dismantles the Bretton Woods system by removing the US from the gold standard. And now suddenly all these currencies are free floating. They only have value in relation to one another. And the IMF, which had existed to support a fixed exchange rate system, it suddenly seemed to lack purpose. And so people were asking, is this institution obsolete? Is it rudderless? Where does it go from here? And then the second event comes in 1973 with the oil crisis, where in response to Western nation support for Israel's war against Syria and Egypt, Arab oil-producing nations raised the price of oil. And this is targeted at Western nations, but it also impacts countries in the global South, and particularly Latin America. Because in this time, a lot of Latin American countries were undertaking programs of domestic industrialization, trying to build strong, heavy industrial sectors that would be independent from the global North, that would be self-reliant. And in order to do that, they needed to import oil. But suddenly the cost goes up and they need to turn to commercial banks in order to raise the funds to import more oil. So they accrue a lot of debt that way. And then the third event comes when Paul Volcker raises the interest rates in 79 or 80. Because what that does now, it makes it so that these Latin American countries, they just can't pay the interest on their debt anymore. And that motivates defaults in 1982. So Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina, they all default on their debt because the interest rates are so much. I read a statistic that said that if you redistributed the debt amongst the populations of Mexico, every Mexican would owe $1,000 US to the United States every year. And in Argentina, it was $1,500. So just unsustainable amounts of debt. And in response to this, a Reagan official, James A. Baker, he draws up something called the Baker Plan, which says that the only logical response to the debt crisis in Latin America is what he calls structural adjustment, meaning that they will send, the IMF, will send a delegation into these countries, and they will oversee the institution of very rigid reforms, what we would now call neoliberal reforms, centered around things like wage freezes, cuts to public spending, openness to foreign capital, and privatization. And Baker, he proposes this to the IMF in 1985, and they immediately accept. And this is what we have seen now since 1985 across the global south. IMF delegations get sent in, they impose these rigid economic prescriptions, and in a lot of cases, well, you could say probably all cases, nothing good comes out of that. So by the end of the 80s, around 3/4 of Latin America and about 2/3 of Africa are under some kind of IMF and World Bank supervision. Those are statistics from the book Unholy Trinity by Richard Peet. And we continue to see the effects of this all over: rising unemployment, reduced access to healthcare, to food, to clean water. Actually, just this week, I read an article in The Guardian that said there are around 100 quote unquote debt distressed nations in the global south, which have been totally unable to manage the COVID crisis and are unable to manage the worsening climate change crisis because their states have been so eroded by these structural adjustment policies that they have essentially no power to do these things. That brings us basically to the present. There are a lot of threads that we can pull in this answer, but that's just a broad overview.
That was an excellent overview, I must say. So Owen, Jason, you want to follow up with a question?
Yeah. I had some kind of introductory questions. Questions. Another thing that you talk about in your article is the means-based policy, and that is something that we are far too familiar with here in the United States. It actually feels like the mentality to make people jump through hoops for any type of government aid that weeds out bad people that supposedly exploit the system. Think welfare, especially welfare reform during the Clinton years, drug testing to get food stamps and shit, food assistance, low-income housing, for example. How does the means-based approach dictate IMF fiscal policy?
Yeah, so in one of my articles for Canadian Dimension, I write about the Indian economist Prabhat Patnaik, who talks about two different approaches to aid, one being the means-based approach and the other being the rights-based approach. And he describes the means-based approach as an approach which basically says, as long as we spread the capitalist means of production across the global south, that will inevitably resolve issues like poverty, stuff like this. And he juxtaposes that with rights-based approach, which says that it is actually the human rights that we identify that should guide it. And it should not be the economic system that dictates what we do and we don't do. So with the IMF, you definitely see a means-based approach. You definitely see this attitude that as long as people in the global south have access to a market and they're able to move in that market, and Milton Friedman says this, just make decisions on their own, that will inevitably lead to reduced poverty in the global south because the market works its magic. And you could definitely relate that to, like you said, programs in the US, means-based approaches, which say that, only certain people can access certain resources. That's definitely a part of the IMF and the World Bank programs as well. But I also say in the article that the rights-based approach, I mean, that is obviously the way to go. I mean, we can't just let capital dictate what we do and we don't do.
And the whole idea behind the means-based approach is that markets will solve everything. And the American attitude, the American policy approach to healthcare, right, where you don't provide healthcare, you provide opportunities to get healthcare, right? But you put the onus on the individual to survive somehow in a healthcare marketplace. That's very much in keeping with the same mentality as what the World Bank and IMF through these structural adjustment programs pushed on entire countries.
So
access, that's right, access, not opportunity, access.
Well, one of the reasons why I was particularly interested in this show, and particularly your work on the IMF and the World Bank and structural adjustment programs, is that my familiarity with how this turned out, particularly in Haiti under the Aristide regime, when Aristide was taken out in a coup in 1991 and was returned by the then Clinton administration. One of the main things that was required of him was to sign on to major neoliberal structural adjustment packages and programs. And the direct consequence of those policies led to the eventual bankrupting of the Haitian state, because all of these state assets, the state cement company, the control of the ports, the telephone company, the electrical company, all of the state-run corporations that provided revenue for the state were not only sold off to private corporations, many of them were sold off to elites who were related to institutions that were friends of the Clintons, as a matter of fact. And it was this massive transformation and loss of state revenue in Haiti, combined with the interjection of non-governmental organizations known as NGOs, that basically started the ever worsening precipitation and destabilization of the Haitian government that we see causing the chaos in Haiti today. So for me, this is not theoretical in terms of seeing how this plays out. You know, there's a real world example in terms of my own kind of family experience coming from a country affected by these things. Can you explain how exactly similar situations have played out throughout the global South? I know in your articles you talk about Burkina Faso, you talk about Ecuador, you talk about particularly in Africa as well. But can you, I don't know if you're familiar with the book by, I forgot the name of the author, Reflections of an Economic Hitman. It was a good book that came out a while ago that talks about the way in which the IMF and the World Bank are the kind of first steps of the shock troops that are sent out to try to get these global South countries to acquiesce to economic paradigms that basically parasitically drain them for the benefit of the first world economic interests. And eventually, if they do not surrender, the jackals come and there will be a coup or an assassination or what have you. So, Owen, if you can really talk about, how, as I explained, how this worked out in Haiti, other examples, John Perkins, Confessions of an Economic Hitman, correct. How this plays out, whether you want to go to South America, Latin America, Africa.
Yeah, sure. I love what you say about Haiti and how Aristide was pressured into these programs, because what you see with the IMF so many times is how it totally constrains ideological difference in the countries where it is trying to impose its structural adjustment programs. And an example that I find really interesting is Jamaica. So the Jamaican industrial sector is very reliant on bauxite, which is used to manufacture aluminum. And in the 50s and in the 60s, and before, of course, there was a very unequal distribution of wealth when it came to bauxite manufacturing. And this dissatisfaction with the status quo led to the election of Michael Manley in 1972. He was part of the Democratic Socialist People's National Party. And he was elected with a mandate to use revenues from the bauxite industry to fund social programs, healthcare, access to education, literacy programs, all of this. But in order to do this, he needed to, of course, get the funds. And he didn't have sort of like a radical Cuba-style program, so he wasn't going to just seize the means of production. And he would go to commercial banks in the global north. He went to the IMF, but he maintained good relations with a lot of socialist governments in the hemisphere, which caused him to become a target of the United States. They cut bauxite imports, and a lot of the main bauxite companies in Jamaica, which were based in North America, they cut production too, which led to an increased economic crisis. Michael Manley had to continuously go to the IMF, and they continuously gave him more and more severe structural adjustment prescriptions, including 1980, which is the last year of his presidency. They told him to cut $300 million from state expenditures. And in response to this, the Jamaican Minister of Finance, a man named Hugh Small, flew to Washington and spoke directly to the IMF's board of directors. And I have a short quote here from the book, The Poverty Brokers, by the Latin America Bureau, this non-governmental organization. And Hugh Small said to the IMF, "According to our calculations, if the United States was asked to make an adjustment of this relative magnitude, it would need to reduce the federal budget for 1980 to 81 by some $103 billion US. There would also have to be retrenchment of some 1,700,000 employees from the state and federal administrations. We cannot think of any better way to dramatize the asymmetry of adjustment and the problem of conditionality as it affects the developing countries in real human terms." And in response to this, the IMF called Jamaica a, quote, spoiled child. So, and then to bring this all home, in 1980, Michael Manley was crushed by the right-wing Labor Party.
Seaga,
yes. So, yeah, Cuba.
So I think that one thing that might be useful to discuss is why do these organizations have so much power? And it stems from, in your example, international trade. When you have economies that are integrated across borders, you need to have some basis of exchange. And that, after the end of the gold standard, becomes the US dollar. So the creditor nations that can provide loans and funding in hard currency have this structural advantage. Their currency, those loans, can pay for imports of oil. They can pay for imports of bauxite. They can pay for the essentials that an industrializing country needs to develop, or that any country needs if you import food or medicine just for human welfare. And if you're a country in the global south, you can print as much money as you want, but you're not able to make purchases internationally unless you have access to hard currency. And it's the IMF and the World Bank that coordinate to determine what terms you'll be able to access that hard currency with. If countries, a lot of people might ask, like, why don't you just reject the loans? Why don't you just try to go your own way? But under conditions of underdevelopment, it is extraordinarily difficult to domestically advance or industrialize without access, without extensive imports of technology, extensive imports of materials. And a lot of countries in the global south had gone through industrialization, the industry that they had was outdated and consumed a lot of oil. It was energy inefficient. They also had population booms, explosions, which increased the needs of their people. But the only way to access the international economy was through the hard currency that the IMF and the World Bank were really the only ones who could provide.
And another important purpose that the IMF serves in the global financial system is that it often, gives its stamp of approval to countries that are trying to develop and to go through these international lending channels. There have been a lot of examples. Jamaica is one, Peru is another, of countries that try to go to commercial banks in the global north, but a lot of them won't agree to give loans unless these countries agree to implement structural adjustment programs.
It's like a credit rating agency for national governments, right? Unless you have the imprimatur of the World Bank and the IMF, and they say that you're a responsible borrower, then commercial banks are unwilling to take that risk. And, why would they? The countries in the global south need the money. North bankers in the centers of capital don't need to make those loans. You can turn down Uganda and just loan to what you would give to them to Nigeria. While if Uganda can't get loans from anybody, that has serious human welfare and developmental consequences. And during the Cold War, the Soviets did represent an alternative source. For instance, Cuba managed the economic program and the survival itself largely through the Soviets providing what Cuba couldn't manufacture or couldn't produce themselves, especially fuel. Now, in the kind of multipolar moment that we're in, there's the Asian Development Bank. You can go to China, you can go to Europe. There's some alternatives to the IMF and the World Bank. And so they've lost a little bit of their monopoly power. But often the alternative sources of funding have very similar requirements for what they consider to be responsible borrowers.
Well, I'd like to, before I'm going to let Jason go, but I want to make a very important, I think it's something that's important for us to really understand. When we have discussions and we shows, when we're talking about imperialism, and one of the, I think the very limited perspectives that people on the left or progressives, whatever term you want to use, have when we say imperialism or being anti-imperialism, is that often we envision militaristic terms. You know what I'm saying? Invading countries, taking sovereignty, coup d'etats. And one of the things that I appreciate so much about Owen's work is that he talks about economic neocolonialism as really being the way in which imperialism's ugly head is reared in the most noxious of ways, where you can control countries, whole swaths of the world in the global south without having to worry about, a coup, or without having to worry about, sending in the military or the Marine Corps or the hit squad, if you will. And I'm wondering if this particular aspect of how international capitalism works to maintain the chokehold of the global south and developing countries is something that we really don't effectively analyze, discuss, dissect, and more importantly, provide alternatives to.
Well, isn't that kind of so? In that documentary that I took a lot of that footage from, I think it's called War by Other Means, they talk about a nuclear power plant that was built in the Philippines when Marcos was president, and or it was proposed when Marcos was president, and I think Aquino, when she got in office, tried to stop it. But that power plant was built on the intersection of like 3 earthquake fault lines.
Fukushima times a million.
And it also destroyed an area that people used for crops, for agriculture. And a lot of these projects, one thing that we're not talking about, we're talking about the economic impact, which is dire, but there's also an environmental impact. When we look at places like Brazil, it's dire. It's literally destroying the planet. It's displacing people, killing industries, local industries, especially when we talk about agriculture in places like India, like I said, the Philippines, Latin America.
Well, I want to challenge Cuba, because Cuba is, you are a development specialist by training, you've worked in the belly of the beast in terms of consulting and whatnot. I understand you've kind of altered your worldview as a product of being outside of those spaces. But I'm going to ask you a very serious question. How does a politics of a more humane, more socialist, or more, just to say humane, I mean, we don't even have to get as radical, economic model, how do people who actually want to make a world a better place and create some economic justice for places that are being literally just kind of ripped apart by this traditional paradigm, IMF, World Bank, structural adjustment, so on and so forth, how exactly can there be a movement to end this and change it when the actual mechanisms of international economy are intertwined in a way where currency, credit, the SWIFT system, every single element of how valuation of trades for goods and services function is premised on reifying this existing hierarchy. And as you were saying, even the new guys on the block, whether it be the Chinese or the Asian development banks, may be a better option, but they're still working on similar terms. So the question becomes, how exactly, and Owen can jump in as well, how exactly can we create an alternative model to this? What is there an alternative model to this? Are we stuck with saying, well, viva la revolution, that's it? I mean, like, what exactly happens? What is the practical politics to create alternatives to this?
So that's an excellent question. And there's a couple of different ways to respond to it depending on where you're situating yourself. So in 1998, there was a debt crisis all across Southeast Asia, where basically there was a boom and bust cycle that became very extreme, but a lot of the money that had gone into funding the boom period was denominated in foreign currency, which created a crunch as the value of local currencies collapsed. And the IMF was able to use that moment to force structural adjustment policies on Southeast Asian countries, which had resisted them successfully through the 70s and 80s. So Malaysia, South Korea, the whole Squid Games pressure of debt on South Koreans really takes off in 1998 because of the financial crisis. And it created a period of incredible suffering across the region, but governments took the lesson to heart and everyone started hoarding US dollars. Whatever you exported, you banked that money. China, Japan, South Korea, Indonesia, Malaysia, all of these countries have substantial reserves of US dollars so that they don't have to go to the IMF or the World Bank in case of another crisis. They never want to be in that position again. So that's one means of potentially improving your situation if you are a national government. If you're in the global north, there's a movement to tackle the problem of existing national debt in countries, Africa, the Middle East, Latin America, where they're still paying off loans made in the 60s and 70s. And that's through the concept of odious debt, that a dictator or a corrupt political leader has the authority to take out debt and then put the entire nation on the hook. But if that debt is not for the national interest, if it can be classified as odious debt because it was immediately stolen or it went into sort of corrupt practices, then that debt should be invalidated. And that it's a difficult argument to make, and it's a tough battle to fight. But that's another way to try to force a rebalancing based on like ethical lines within the current system. There's also been changes in the approach of the IMF and the World Bank internally, as some of the leadership has come to terms with their record of complete failure on the developmental front. For instance, when Greece was experiencing its financial crisis after 2008 because of what might be described as odious debt taken out by pre-2008 governments once they got on the euro, the European Central Bank was adamant on applying the harshest possible terms, making an example out of Greece. The IMF was actually the voice of reason in that debate, arguing that if you bled them too much, then they'd never be able to pay the loan off because they would be liquidating all of their essential infrastructure and capital that they would need for next year's productivity or for productivity in the future. The IMF wasn't particularly successful in trying to steer European policy in that direction, but just taking that position that structural adjustment taken too far actually de-industrializes, de-develops the states that are subject to it rather than promoting growth. That move alone represented a significant change in the way that they advocated for the international economic framework. So those are some different attempts to try to redress the obvious problems of the international financial system. And, unfortunately, for some of them, you have to be, a head of state or a higher up in an international organization. But I think odious debt, advocating for the forgiveness, the abolition of odious debt, that would be a place where you could significantly improve the international economy if you could get traction behind that.
Owen, you want to jump in?
Yeah, somebody in the chat mentioned ALBA, which I think is really interesting. These sort of new regionalist, you could say Bolivarian organizations developing in Latin America directly in opposition to IMF policy. So you've got ALBA, UNASUR, and then the proposed Bank of the South, which unfortunately hasn't come to fruition yet. But these are all very interesting, very promising organizations developed by people in the global South for those people, as opposed to the IMF serving global North capital. And something else that Kuba touched on is the way that these international financial institutions evolve as different problems present themselves. And in terms of my own writing, what I touch on a lot is how a lot of these changes are purely rhetorical in many cases. So I write a lot about the PRSPs, or Poverty Reduction Strategy Papers, which the IMF developed in response largely to a lot of opposition on the African continent to their policies. And these PRSPs, they release one every few years for each member country, for each, they call them HIPCs, highly indebted poor countries. And most of them are in Africa. But in terms of actual material changes that are advocated by these PRSPs, you go and read them, and it's basically structural adjustment. just under the language of poverty reduction. And you saw this with the World Bank too, especially under the leadership of Robert McNamara. So these were all things that I just wanted to touch on and relate to my own writing in terms of like how alternatives can develop in the global south and how these organizations adapt to try to adopt a more amenable language.
Well, the idea of self-help in the global south, that would be very effective as long as there are industrialized countries within that grouping that can provide the imports that other economies in the collective need and are willing to perhaps give up premiums that they could win by selling those same exports into the international market. The problem with self-help on the global south is that there are essential products, especially high-tech products, high-tech goods, that are inputs for modern industrializations that aren't produced in the global south. So one essential step that would be necessary to make that work would be to get knowledge and technology transfer from developed countries. China would be one potential source, but the EU, Japan, maybe the Malaysia and Southeast Asia, places where you have that advanced manufacturing that produce semiconductors, that produce solar cells. If they were in on it, then it could be extremely helpful. The problem is that if you have a collective where everybody has the same economic profile, then you could potentially bargain to drive down the cost of imports using that greater mass, but you're still dependent on external sources for essential inputs.
Cuba, I want to ask you both a follow-up question, but definitely I'd like Cuba's expertise on this. Is that one of the I guess unintended consequences of the current kind of dialectic, if you will, that we find ourselves in this moment, is that with the rise of this reactionary nationalism that we see in the West, in Europe, in the United States with Trump, South America, we have Bolsonaro. We know we have Boris Johnson in Britain. We have Marine Le Pen in France. We know the names of the usual suspects of these individuals. We know that there's a massive aversion and kind of contempt for what they call these globalists, if you will, or international liberal democratic institutions. The party of Davos, the World Bank, the IMF, all of these kind of so on and so forth. Is the rise of that politics causing these traditional actors, particularly the IMF and the World Bank, who works in unison with this kind of global elite capital kind of ruling class consensus, is this causing them a certain crisis in terms of how they view they should go forward? In other words, is this, and I'm not saying we should encourage the rise of the reactionary nationalism at all. What I'm saying is that could this dialectic be a point upon which the crisis causes an opening to make demands for a new politics on these policies? Are they feeling that kind of concern? I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
I think that there's two sources of pressure placed on organizations like the IMF and the World Bank. One is exactly like you said, the reactionary right-wing anti-globalists. And the other is the rise of China, to a certain extent, Russia, other potential sources for technology, capital, expertise that the global South needs. And I don't think that the IMF would have had as much soul searching about the Greek debt crisis were it not for the fact that these alternatives, especially the Chinese-led bloc, Belt and Road Initiative, etc., are there in the wings. And the IMF and World Bank, for all their power and authority and throughout the 20th century, have very little to show for all their promises of economic development in the global South. So I think that there is a real issue in the international economy about what the role of these organizations should be, what it can be as well. Because if you begin to roll back globalization through putting up trade and investment barriers, then the type of international markets that these organizations depend on become a lot more complicated, and global financial interests don't have the same opportunity and the same authority that they have to demand profit premiums for making loans.
Oh, and
we'll see what happens to things like NAFTA and other trade agreements, but that is a point of vulnerability within the system.
Oh, and you want to jump in?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of whether or not China, or to a lesser extent Russia, will actually pose a direct threat to IMF and to the IMF and the World Bank, I mean, I guess I'm not as hopeful, possibly. I don't really see these organizations weakening so much as just adapting the language surrounding these issues. I mean, you give the Greek example, but there was just this report that I mentioned about how there are 100 debt-distressed countries which are unable to adapt to COVID. They're unable to adapt to climate change. And it's possible that China or other trading blocs would represent a light at the end of the tunnel there. But I mean, when I look at these countries, when I look at these structural adjustment policies, I just see more of the same, and pretty much that for the foreseeable future.
Cool, but you want to retort?
We are coming up on the hour.
We can end on a down note.
Well, I knew this conversation was going to be extremely depressing, because in making the video, I know how the show is going to go and how depressing the video is that I have to make for the show. And this video was, the worst still so far is the immigration video, where I had the audio of the kids being ripped away from their parents, and immigration was pretty horrible. But this is equally as fucking frightening. The environmental aspect, the aspect, when you think about the fact that most of these countries will never get out from under this debt, and the legacy of leaders that have been assassinated or couped when they try to have any sort of counter-hegemonic policies, i.e. Thomas Sankara, Hugo Chavez. Go for it, Kuba.
So I'm looking at the chat, and I'm listening to Owen's take, and I think I've got a Pascal point to make about the importance of bipolarity and having non-Western great powers. So one way that you can deal with an accumulated generations-long debt is to just repudiate it. Say that they're not going to get their money. And that's a way in which Russia and China can play a role, because if a country is within the security umbrella of either one of those powers, well, the money doesn't go to Beijing, the money doesn't go to Moscow. So that creates an opportunity for heavily indebted countries to simply repudiate Western debt, so long as they can also sacrifice Western markets for their exports, and Western imports replace them with similar technologies or similar goods from Russia or China. And honestly, if you're Cambodia, if you're Myanmar, that actually seems like an entirely viable play.
Mm. Well, isn't Cambodia suffering from dealing with China at the moment?
Oh, yeah. I mean, like, it's pick your poison, right? I'm not saying that you won't immediately get into a yuan-dominated death spiral, but, like, you can tell the Wall Street and City of London bankers to go to hell.
I have to have a conversation with you at some point off air, because I did run into a young lady that wrote a critique about the Cambodia-China relationship. And I wanted to have a panel discussion with the Rizniski Tan clan and this young lady about that whole situation with China and Cambodia. Owen, thank you once again for coming on. Wherever you are watching this show, there are links in the description to Owen's writing, the articles that we have in question. And Owen even has a new, or we were talking about, Owen even has a new piece up about was it the Guatemalan Civil War? I didn't get a chance to read it.
Yeah, it goes back to Canadian involvement in Guatemala, back to the Arbenz coup, and then it brings it all the way through the Civil War and then into the present. That's at Alberata.
We have a super chat here as we head off. Let's read it. Great show. Thanks for the discussion. The new edition of Michael Hudson's book, Super Imperialism, is out. Essential reading along the lines that you're talking about here. Nice opening video, Jason. Thank you. Thank you very much, Stephanie Welch. So I'll say this again. I've said it before. We do appreciate when you guys suggest people to us. What we appreciate more is if you have an end to these people, because it's harder than you think to book people, especially cats like Michael Hudson that makes the rounds with speaking engagements, because they tend to have agents, and it's a real big to do. And I got an email from someone, I'll tell you guys off air, who politely declined. And me and this person actually were on an NPR show together, and I was really hoping she'd come on, but you'd be surprised. So it's harder than you think to get people on, which is why Pascal and I are doing stuff. We're doing some more stuff on some other channels. So once again, thank you, Owen.
Great.
For all the patrons, the link is coming up. Kuba, are you coming with us on the patron bonus half to talk some crazy shit?
Sure.
Because I think we want to ask you some more questions about what you do on the Death Star.
It's just pressing buttons. Sometimes it's switch flipping, but on a good day.
And don't forget, tomorrow at 1 p.m. Eastern time, I will be on The Majority Report with Sam Cedar and Emma Vigeland discussing the piece I wrote, I Was a Teenage Anarchist, about the cultures of deconstruction and the cultures of authenticity and how they negatively impact the left. And we are out.